Hi, welcome to PhDizzle. I'm your host, Alice Cheng, and today I'm interviewing Dr. Mel Li, who got her PhD in Biomedical Engineering from Georgia Tech and is currently a game designer at Riot Games. Awesome, because what you're doing now is so different than what you studied in school, but I wanted to take it back and learn a little bit more about what you studied in school. So maybe tell me a little bit about your journey into biomedical engineering and the reason why you decided to pursue a PhD.
So when I was in my undergrad, I spent a really long time just kind of thinking about hey, what do I kind of want to do with my life? And the thing that I really landed on wanting to do with, in that stage was working in global health. And I had seen this really amazing presentation when I was in my undergrad about doing engineering for sustainable health solutions. And I thought that was a really amazing field to go into. I went on, read a bunch of books. I don't know if you're familiar with Paul Farmer, but he's written some really amazing books about global health. And I think they were all incredibly inspiring to me. So initially, what I had wanted to do was work on global health applications. And coming out of undergrad, one of the projects that I had worked on was genetic engineering for this compound called artemisinin and how to produce that in bacteria. Artemisinin is a malarial drug, but it's very non-scalable to produce. So the idea was to genetically engineer bacteria to create those precursors more easily. Coming off of that project, I was like, wow, this whole field sounds amazing. I think I want to work on maybe something like genetic engineering oriented, but definitely something that went towards that global health goal. So with that in mind, I sent out my grad school applications. I got set up with Georgia Tech. And I think at the time, I wasn't super familiar with, I guess, how much a school's focus and the research there kind of ends up influencing what you end up studying as a PhD student. I ended up working on a bunch of different projects, first trying out the kind of genetic engineering thing, and then realizing, oh, but actually there were aspects to the more mechanical side of bioengineering that were really fascinating and that felt really satisfying because they were things that I could touch and feel and really easily describe to people, and also just things that I knew could potentially show up in the market in 50 years or something like that.
Did you do work in the public health space, or was it totally different in grad school?
Yeah, it's funny because when I got to tech, I realized tech as a school actually has a much different focus in the way that their research goes, and one of their main drives of the BME program over at Tech was cardiovascular engineering. And so I think part of what I went through when I was there looking for the right advisor and the right project was, I think there's just so many things to kind of keep in your head when you're looking for a PhD advisor. It's what do I want to work on? What's the kind of personality that I work best with? What are things that I could see working out in my future? What feels satisfying? But anyway, there's all these different factors, and you're trying to stick them all together and be okay, this is going to be the focus of a giant chunk of my life, which is just so stressful too, I think. I actually ended up in a project that was looking at diagnostics for platelet behavior. I was working with David Koo on the sort of more bio side, and then Craig Forrest on the more kind of mechanical engineering side. And so what we were doing was we were developing microfluidic diagnostics that were testing the behavior of platelets under shear forces. So the idea is that a lot of cardiovascular disease or acute disease comes from when blood vessels are constricted and then the platelets kind of form a plug and will stop blood flow, and that's what actually causes a potentially fatal heart attack. So our idea was that we were going to test how do different blood samples behave when they're treated with different cardiovascular drugs, and how does that change their mechanical behavior under shear. And the idea is that maybe we can look at drug efficacy using a model like this. Certainly it was a little bit far away from my initial goal of hey, I want to work on global health, but I think that in my head a lot of it was about go through the act of kind of creating a physical diagnostic for blood, and that's something that can take you to a lot of different directions. I was able to find applications for a postdoc position that was absolutely more in that global health diagnostic space. It was kind of a stretch at the time, but one that I'm yeah, I kind of don't regret that. That really felt like it took me in the right direction.
I mean, I feel like any biology or like device, anything that applies to health can apply to global health technically, right? So
Yeah.
it works.
Yeah, it's definitely true. A lot more of the global health is about like how do you make more robust solutions for
Yeah.
problems and low cost solutions. And just global health engineering as a field is really interesting because so much of it deals with finding the right application for things and more specific responses for maybe a diagnostic that's like already been developed but needs tweaking in certain areas.
I think that's the thing with research and even grad school. It's like what you do is, I mean, even if you were working on a specific application, a lot of times what you do as a PhD student is so specific and so deep that it's not like, oh, I actually created the solution, but it is like one part to the solution. And so maybe your technology wasn't directly relevant or whatever, but down the road, it'll contribute to a body of research that should hopefully help people down the road.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think going into the process also, I had always just kind of like romanticized a lot of like what my thesis might mean or be. And I think reading a lot of science journalism also, it just kind of like raises your bar for what you expect a single person can do. The more that you go through it, the more you realize it is kind of like that standing on the shoulders of giants sort of thing. And the thing that you study is not only like specifically important for that field, but also just a really important exercise for you as a person to kind of go through that process of deeply understanding a problem and creating your own solution for it.
You mentioned you did a postdoc also. Was that also at Georgia Tech or somewhere else?
No, so it's interesting because like I remember when I was like a wee little undergrad, one of the projects that I was super excited about was a paper diagnostic that was made in this lab at the University of Washington that was run by Dr. Paul Yager. Dr. Yager is just like such an iconic figure to me still. He is just he's just like this wonderful man and just a very like warm and caring person, and was just an incredible postdoc advisor to have. But also he just has this like I don't know how to describe this any other way, but like he has this sense of wonder about the world, and he is kind of a big nerd and like has this like big sci-fi book collection, and he loved to talk about like how science fiction and fantasy can influence our ideas as scientists and shape a lot of pop culture's worldview, and indirectly that can contribute to really interesting products in research and engineering. And I think I kind of like internalized that a lot and kind of forgot it. It's funny to me looking back as like a person who's now working in entertainment and thinking about how that feels like it applies to my life still.
So you did like science, and after that you started transitioning into gaming, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and one of the things I remember, and so you can tell me about your journey into it, but one of the things I remember at Georgia Tech, I came down there's like the spiral staircase in like, I guess it was like the IBB building, I forget what building, and I remember I feel like, I don't quite remember, but you were like riding something across the floor. I don't know if it was like you were sitting on something and getting pulled across the floor or something. I don't remember. I don't know if it was like a Comic-Con thing. I'm not sure, but I like remember these like tidbits of like things about you. I just always thought it was really interesting, but you transitioned from science and doing research into something seemingly really different. I mean, you just said that there was maybe some type of correlation there, but tell me about that journey and how you, I guess, was it always there, like planted as a seed, or were you just like one day, like, I'm doing it?
So I think I remember the times that you're talking about. I think like one of those influences was actually one of my PIs, Greg Forrest. He was just he was like a younger professor and had just like a ton of energy. And one of the things that he just really loved to do and like encourage us to do is create things on our own and just live a very like creative forward lifestyle. A bunch of my friends back then kind of like got me into like a whole it's a hobby called cosplay, and so like people will like make fantasy related props and kind of like go to conventions with each other and just kind of like live in a fantasy world for a while. When I was at Tech, actually, I got really into this scene, and Dragon Con is this huge convention that's in Atlanta. And so I had a bunch of friends who were going, and one of the things that we used to do our creative engineering powers to like weird uses was to like really elaborate props. That's a hobby that I still have today. But I think like that kind of like outlet or like it felt like an outlet to me working on engineering for like or just spending my time on making projects for entertainment purposes and like in that kind of like gaming and entertainment sphere. That was something that I was kind of serious about because I've always taken individual projects pretty seriously. I think they can be really cool outlets, especially when, you know, you're in the stage when you're out of like a university setting and you're trying to like teach yourself things. And that I think was like an attitude and a habit that Craig really encouraged for all of us to do. I think is kind of actually like what led me into gaming eventually. So when I was in my postdoc, I was working on some projects outside of work that were just hobby and entertainment stuff. And I got a call from a guy from Maker Faire, and he was like, hey, we saw your project somewhere on the internet. Do you want to come to our Maker Faire in Rome? We can pay your like travel fee and stuff.
Rome? Rome? Europe Rome?
Yeah.
Wow.
So
Not like
just
Rome, Georgia.
That's what I assumed at first, right? Yeah, it was just this random side thing, but it was a serious enough, I don't know, trip or experience that I kind of like started thinking about like, oh hey, like is there some kind of side career that I might consider that's like in this general space of like entertainment and creating things. I had actually just finished up my postdoc, and so for me, that's kind of like a space in your life where you're like, okay, I've like finished the known track of things, and I've checked all the boxes, and like my next big step is potentially the kind of like rest of your life step. And so I was like, well, you know, I never took off any time in between my undergrad and grad school, or grad school and postdoc. It was just like always going all the time. And my friend was like, hey, what are you going to be doing in your next job? And I'm like, oh, you know, I haven't figured it out yet. And they were like, well, why don't you like take a job doing something completely different as kind of just like a break from things, because you've been just doing this one thing your whole life, and like why don't you just check out other stuff? And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And when I was in Seattle at the time, so I was working at the University of Washington, and a bunch of people there played this card game called Magic the Gathering that I used to play when I was like, gosh, in like middle school or something. And so they were like, oh yeah, you should just apply, and then like you can just spend some time here and just see what it's like, and then, you know, go on to your like real world whatever job. I was like, oh yeah, that sounds like actually a great plan. And at the time, just global health jobs are really hard to get, as you can probably imagine. They're very specifically like in Seattle, usually funded by some kind of Gates Foundation money, but they're just tricky to find and can be few and far between and require a lot of specialization. So I was like, well, you know what I'm going to do is I'm just going to lay low for a bit, wait until that market opens up, and in the meantime, I'm just going to have fun, just on a lark, like apply and see what I can get over at Magic the Gathering, where a few of my friends are working. So it just turned out that they were like, oh, hey, you've got analytical skills. You could come on as like a part-time business analyst, and we'll figure out, you know, the rest of the portion. So from there, I moved into becoming a writer for games. And then after that, I got a call from the company that I'm at right now, Riot, and they were like, hey, you know, we're making a game as well. We're looking for a game writer. Do you want to work with us? And they also kind of like let writers figure out what they want to do. So from a writer, I turned into a game designer, and that's where I am now.
Amazing. Well, did you feel like you were ready? Because you said you were playing these things already, so it's like you kind of know what's going on, but working in that environment was like, was it a totally different skill set? Like, did you have to pick it up, or was it just like common sense?
It's interesting. I think it's a little bit of both. Yeah, at the time, I'd also been like really kind of seriously also been doing like art and painting and drawing for a while. So I had been really interested actually in like drawing comics and writing them as well. During that time, I was training myself to do various things like how do I tell a story through visuals? How do I actually like tell that story through words? And I hadn't really been super serious about it. And I think one of the nice things about coming off of a postdoc salary is you're like, oh, hey, if I just take an associate job, it's already more dollars than I would get as an associate or
I literally thought about working at the mall. I was like, I could literally do any job and I would make more than what I'm making now.
Oh my God, yeah, it is crazy. Like, it's totally crazy too. Like,
Seattle's also $15 an hour, right? So that's like good.
Yeah, it was actually really stressful living in Seattle on a postdoc salary because, I mean, the cost of living itself is just so high. Yeah. And there were people in my lab, like, oh my God, I have so many good things to say about people who work in global health. They're just like some of the nicest, most like generous people I know. But it was almost like, I don't know, like I feel like it almost felt like self-sacrificing in a way, because the postdoc salary that I was in the red for, just trying to like rent an apartment, there were people in my lab who like had kids and stuff, and I'm just like, this must be so difficult. It's pretty unfair, I think, like the kind of like costs that postdocs are working under, and it's a tough lifestyle for sure. In terms of like job movement though, when you're getting paid a postdoc salary, like you said, it's really easy to just go anywhere because you're like, oh great, like a mid-level job or an associate job, like can be fine. Being okay with moving into an associate position where you're still nominally learning, people can be like, oh okay, like, I'm happy to teach you, especially if you're doing other like specific work over in here that might be more specialized. The PhD came in handy a lot because I had sort of like specific skills using analytical techniques that I had used for business intelligence sorts of things. And then I think on the other hand, it also just forces you to figure out ways to learn. And I think that it's just it's more of like a personal journey, I think, like getting that degree, kind of organizing like how are you going to approach a problem, how do you know when you've actually done the thing right, and how do you pace yourself to keep moving and growing. And I think that was a big part of being able to succeed, even though it was like a really weird transition at the time. So yeah, it was like a bunch of strange random things and hobbies and capabilities learned from grad school all put together.
You said when you first took the job, you're like, oh, let me just do something completely different for a little bit and maybe I'll go back. So it's been a couple years now. So is it still like going back on your radar? Or are you like, this is a new me and this is like my new life now?
I get so caught up in a work project. Like when the work is interesting and engaging, I don't really think about what else could I be doing.
Yeah.
It's definitely like a lot of fun. And I think one of the things that can be really challenging about working in research is the kind of distance between you and the people who are using the thing that you're working on. And I know that was pretty difficult for me for a while because I can't even tell people about the things that I work on sometimes, or it's just so complicated that you're like, okay, 10 minutes later,
Yeah.
you're like, I think I understand what you're talking about. Yeah, exactly. So it's really nice being able to kind of share the work that I'm doing. I do think there is an internal reason that I'm like, oh, I really want to work on games. Like I think there's a lot of good that can be done there, and I think it's an environment that could stand for a lot of improvement as well in certain places. I think I'm like overall pretty pleased with the change. I think the one thing that really recently kind of changed things for me was COVID hitting, and it was kind of bizarre thinking about like, oh, I had this whole path for myself laid out in my life that would have put me down a much more, kind of, for want of a better term, just more useful kind of path. And it's just something that I've been thinking about a lot lately because, you know, people are certainly playing games a lot and inside, but, you know, not being there for a thing that I trained and invested a lot in feels pretty weird.
I actually felt the same when COVID hit and they were like, oh, essential workers. And I was like, I mean, I technically could pick up a pipette and be an essential worker, but am I being selfish by working from home and not utilizing my skill set because I don't need to, because I don't work at the bench anymore? I think it is tough. It's tough to grapple with, but I think then you also realize like everyone has their own place in society, and then there are a lot of scientists. I mean, look what by the time this video gets out, we'll have a vaccine. I do feel like there's always that little bit of guilt, but maybe in the end, like maybe for your next career step, you'll find something that's like at the intersection of gaming and healthcare, which is actually like a big thing right now.
Yeah. I've seen a lot of like games as therapy kind of solutions as well. I think that's like a really interesting field that's just sort of like starting to find its feet as well.
Okay, so tell me what you do, because I have no idea. I don't know very much about gaming at all. So what does a game designer do? Like, what's your day look like?
Sure. Gosh. So actually, like really recently, I also did like narrative work, which is a lot more straightforward. It's just like, oh, I'm gonna write a script for a character. I'm going to like talk to artists about like, you know, what are we showing in this background? What is the world like? And kind of like giving people details like that. A game designer is a bit different in that I think there's a lot more kind of technical knowledge involved. For example, like I'll spend most of my day talking to other game designers and sort of like play testing and then figuring out, you know, like, oh, okay, like what do we actually need to change in the game pieces that we have? And then I need to like go write the actual script that tells all the things to like have their certain behaviors. So that very practically is kind of like working in different softwares, working like our kind of like code uses Python, all uploading that to a central repository and stuff. So like that kind of the work is really technical. I think there's also, it definitely speaks to kind of like engineering portion, because like what you're really doing is just like designing a system. And what you're trying to accomplish for the player is, oh, this system that you've created has a lot of nuance to it. A lot of the pieces are balanced and they have interesting interactions with each other. So like the type of game that I work on is like a digital card game. Each card is a game piece, and we want to say like, okay, like, real fun of a game like this is like you have part A and part B, and together they make something that's more fun than, the sum is greater than each of the parts together. A lot of what we talk about as designers is kind of, okay, like how do we make part A and part B have really novel functions together? Or like, how do we make a whole system of parts? So like, 6 different cards or something that are all working similarly, but like all have like really cool and different results when you can put them together in different ways. It definitely feels a lot like, hey, I'm like working with other engineers on a system of pieces, and they're going to be used by people in these certain ways. So it actually feels like familiar in that sense. They just are more people focused, and like I actually like we look through data on occasions that are like, how many people are enjoying this sort of play, how many people like this thing versus this other thing, and that kind of stuff.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, because you were saying you get like immediate feedback because you can see like people are using your product, the thing that you've developed right away.
Yeah, exactly. There are some pieces that are live now that we've been like our game's been live for about a year. Because it's a digital game, also we have immediate tables and numbers and stuff of like what's being used, what's really successful, is this thing unbalanced in the way that it's being used.
So tell me about your background behind you.
Oh yeah, so this is the background that's used in one of our games.
Okay.
So this is. Yeah. We share an IP with League of Legends. League of Legends, of course, is like huge, and so people really love the characters and the world in there. So a big part of what I do, we take a lot of those champions that people know and love, and we're like, okay, like people like this one character, now let's make a whole world that's like associated with them. Let's make these characters who are like their friends and family or whatever, or like their enemies, and let's put them all together in a big world. So this background is this kingdom called Demacia. It's kind of like very like Western fantasy based. League of Legends as a whole is there's like 150 plus characters, and so like, the worlds are like super diverse, and some of them are silly and cute, and some of them are like grimdark or whatever. Demacia is kind of like this very kind of like knights in shining armor kind of world, and this young lady who's standing right here, her name is Lux, and she's a light mage, and so we kind of like tell the story about like, oh, she's like a magic user but in secret, because the world of Demacia is more knights in shining armor and they actually are not into magic. And it's kind of interesting because you can put in all these themes about technology and conservatism and progressivism and stuff like that.
Well, I mean, it sounds like you turned like your hobby into a career. So my next question was, what are your hobbies? So I don't know. I mean, is there anything else that you want to talk about outside of gaming, or like, what do you like to do in your free time?
I honestly just make giant light up weapons. And so like, it's like a thing that I started doing when I was over at Tech, because we had this amazing machine shop. So I remember kids kind of going in there and like their own projects, and I was like, oh, I can make like weird projects too. And so like, no joke, like in my apartment, it's just like full of light up swords. I've been buying 3D printers for a while, and basically my apartment space is just like a workshop. So currently I've got like a desktop laser printer, and at one point I had 2 3D printers and just like a bunch of power tools. But I'm sure you went through this as well in LA. Like my working space here is so much smaller than it used to be. Yeah. So I spent a lot of time just inhaling fumes from stuff in my tiny apartment.
What do you do with all the weapons that you have?
So usually, it's almost just the act of making them that I really like.
Yeah.
Like sometimes I'll go to conventions just to kind of like meet people who like to do the same stuff. Yeah. But honestly, it's just to like meet people who just want to work on weird projects that are like from games and fantasy and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. There's just something really enjoyable about the work with your hands and make a physical object kind of thing. I also like to just make really ornate goods.
Okay.
So I feel like it's just like a compulsion to create stuff, usually stuff that has some kind of like aesthetic element.
It's cool, and you still get to be creative, and it probably helps you find friends fast, because it's so hard, like in a big city like LA, to meet people. And if you have like a really particular interest, it's probably easier to meet them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's actually true for a lot of places now that like the internet is like internet communities are so strong. One of the nice things about like going to these conventions and meeting people is that you just make random friends, and people kind of like talk to each other about various kind of building techniques. I think there's a lot of kind of interesting technical challenges out there that end up teaching me things. So this morning I had a problem with my printer because I wanted to make some kind of like silly object for a prop or something. And learned a lot about kind of like the different like material handlings that go into the creation of the extruder head and all kinds of stuff like that. It's kind of like putting in the lighting for a prop is a multi-step process where I'm working with a microcontroller, I'm programming the microcontroller, I am like doing industrial design on creating a prop that involves like, how do I open this thing up? How do I make sure my lights can stay in place? All kinds of like random things. Where do I hide my batteries? What weight is the battery? Like, how heavy is the battery pack? How does it attach? And all these things. So it ends up being like a very kind of like engineering issue. And a lot of my modeling anyway gets done in like AutoCAD or
PhDizzle.
having fun with smart people who do cool things.